Braniff is the counterterrorism expert and the executive director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. He joins us here in our studio in Washington, and with us from Philadelphia is author and religious historian Anthea Butler. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Anthea, we're told every day of the threat posed by radical Islamic jihadists groups to the United States, but how big is the threat from right-wing groups?
Well, actually, the threat from right-wing groups is bigger than radical Islamicists. And we've seen these statistics come out this week recently to show the uptick, especially since 2008 and the election of President Barack Obama. So it's very interesting to hear a conversation about terrorism right now that doesn't include domestic terrorism in the United States.
Bill, the threat from extremist right-wing groups, has that grown since President Obama became president of the country, or has it declined?
Well, the uptick hasn't been as significant as many feared or were concerned about prior to or during the first inauguration of the president. We've seen, I think, a fairly consistent level of extremist hate crimes as well as terrorism incidents, sort of the spectrum of violent extremist behaviors from right-wing groups. Looking at FBI uniform crime statistics, between 2,000 and 2,500 hate crimes a year, but the number of terrorism incidents is much, much lower based on just definitions. So it's, I think, a persistent threat as opposed to something that is new on the scene.
And it depends very much on what it's called, isn't it? I mean, this latest attack we had on the church in Charleston has been called a hate crime. Mm-hmm. Some people say, why isn't it terrorism?
Right. There's a lot of overlap between those two forms of criminal violence.
Right.
Sometimes it depends on the kind of case that the prosecution intends to leverage. Sometimes it's a more academic discussion. I would include both in the category of violent extremism, hate crime, and terrorism. And I wouldn't say that because something is a hate crime, it's a lesser act than an incident of terrorism. It's a definitional issue that gets us a little bit crosswise. At the end of the day, both are horrific forms of criminal violence that have really oversized impact on our national psyche. So it's not a numbers game. It's about the nature of the violence.
Anthea, when we look at those horrific shooting in Charleston, in which 9 people lost their lives, federal authorities were very quick to label this a hate crime. Yet if we look at state laws, especially in the South, we find that South Carolina, where the shooting took place, as well as Arkansas and Georgia, don't have any hate crime laws.
Well, they don't have any hate crime laws in part because of the people who get to write those laws. I think it's important to point out that in the states where you don't have a hate crime law, you have a predominance of right-wingers. And I think that that is an important step to talk about how do we talk about race, first of all, because if we're going to talk about hate crimes against persons of color, because people are LGBT, other kinds of definitions of what would constitute a hate crime, we have to start to see who are the people making the policies and understand that they're not invested so much in something being a hate crime if we're going to have an uptick in the numbers. And this might be where I disagree with Mr. Braniff in certain respects, because I do think that we've had an uptick. And if you talk about this as being a steady stream, my question back to him would be, then how do we account for this steady stream of domestic violence and terrorism that we have that continues unabated? Why haven't we seen the numbers drop? And that's the question I would pose to him.
You want to respond to that, Bill?
Certainly. I guess I mean to say that the largest number of right-wing extremist groups emerging in the United States emerged in the 1990s, meaning that more emerged in the 1990s than emerged in the 2000s or since 2010 to current date. In the 1920s in the United States, there were between 4 and 5 million members of the KKK. And the KKK has persisted as an organization in the United States. So I see this as a persistent threat. We have a separate data set on individual level radicalization in the United States, and we see continually higher numbers of individuals radicalizing in the right-wing extremist current than we see in left-wing or until much more recently, the violent jihadist spectrum. And so all I mean to say is that this is a persistent and relatively more populous form of extremism in the United States than other forms of ideological extremism in the United States. The uptick, all I mean to say is, I think there's a persistent story here as opposed to a recent phenomenon story.
You talk about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. It is perhaps the best-known group worldwide, you know, because they have a very high profile. They were very active in the 50s in the United States. Are they still very active right now?
They're not necessarily the most active of the organized white supremacist groups any longer. There are other organizations that have that are really populous. I remember reading that there are more members of the Aryan Nation incarcerated in Arizona than there are members of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Just to give you a sense of numbers. Now, numbers are not the only metric here, but there are other organizations in the white supremacist movement have grown precipitously.
Anthea, the Southern Poverty Law Center is a group that monitors hate group in the United States and the rise of hate groups. I want you to listen to what Richard Cohen, who heads that group, had to say.
I think the big increase that we've seen in the number of hate groups in the last 15 years has been a response to the changing demographics in our country. It preceded the election of the president, but was intensified by him. And of course, you know, whenever, you know, a Democratic president comes into office, suddenly people start talking about, oh, they're going to take your guns. And, you know, that whips up hysteria. People start buying ammunition, and these kind of crazed, conspiratorial-minded right-wing militia groups spring up.
To what extent has mainstream politics contributed to the rise of right-wing groups?
I think mainstream policies have contributed to the rise in this way. I'll say, instead of policies, I'd put in politicians. The phrase "take back our country" that became very well used after 2008 and continued to be used was actually used by Dylann Roof in the Charleston, South Carolina shootings. He said, you know, we need to take our country back. I'm the only one. I'm paraphrasing his manifesto. So those kinds of phrasings, that kind of rhetoric, that kind of language has helped to whip up, let's say, these racial sentiments, these racist sentiments. Further, and I think this is a really important point to bring up of what Mr. Braniff is saying, it's not just organized hate anymore, it's the diffuse hate you find on the internet. And I think that is a crucial point for our listeners to remember that, you know, while they're white supremacist groups, many people can get to this kind of rhetoric and hate literature right online in the comfort of their own homes. And perhaps this might have been one way that someone like Dylann Roof was radicalized, because he could read this at home and begin to act out on those things. You don't have to go to a Klan meeting anymore to espouse the beliefs of the Klan. It can come right into your home through the wonders of the internet.
And Bill, when we look at the involvement of the political mainstream in the country, the lines have got very blurred, haven't they? I mean, we find out in this Dylann Roof case, for instance, that one of the groups that inspired him has been donating money to mainstream politicians in the United States.
This is true in terms of all forms of extremist activism. If you're an activist, if you want to actively do something to change your society, you can either engage in missionary, grassroots work, political work, or violent work. Those are the three forms of activism you can choose from, and they're not fully discrete, which is why it's very hard to have an intelligent conversation about these really politicized issues. You talk about someone who believes in the right to bear arms. That constitutionally protected value that is held by many Americans is also advocated by extremists through violent behavior, illegal violent behavior. So violent extremists often use violence to advocate the things that other of us actually really believe in, right? And so there's a lot of overlap there. It makes it really hard to have an intelligent, sober conversation about these issues because they're so emotive. So saying where the line is drawn between mainstream.
I would disagree with that, but.
Well, I guess what I mean
I'm
to say
sorry,
is
I would just disagree with not being able to have an intellectual conversation. I think that's what we're trying to have right now.
Well, we are. I agree. I agree with you, but it's hard to do. And when you're outside of a 27-minute forum in a 30-second soundbite, it's a challenge to be able to really get into this because it's nuanced, and the relationship between mainstream political activism and illegal political activism through violence is blurry, and it takes a little bit of time to disentangle that. To understand the cause and effect at play. What I'll say is that violent political activists are seeking to polarize society. They're trying to use violence as a sledgehammer to drive a wedge issue deeper into our psyche and make you pick one side or the other, as if there was no common ground in the middle for us to engage in with each other. And the relationship between mainstream politics and polarization and political violence and polarization, I think, is a really important thing to understand. These groups want us to be able to have to say, I'm on one side or the other, and that there's no middle ground for us to engage in civic conversation.
And sometimes we also see, Anthea, that the media is totally out of step with reality. I was looking at some figures, and it goes back to something you said right at the outset of the program. I was looking at these figures from the New America Foundation. They released a report which said that since the 9/11 attacks, the number of right-wing attacks, 19 right-wing attacks, killing 48 people. And then if we look at jihadist attacks or attacks inspired by radical Islam, 7 attacks resulting in 26 deaths. Yet, if we listen or watch the media, it looks the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. I do think it's important, however, to talk about how we measure and what our definitions are, because I think this is where Mr. Braniff and I would agree that how you make the definition about terrorism or right-wing attacks is also important about how you do the counting. And it also depends on who's doing the counting. I will always say what one of my favorite sociology professors says, you can make the numbers look like whatever you want them to look like. It just depends on where you pull them from. So I think it's also important when we talk about these issues, if we're going to start to measure that we need to start to measure the uptick in all kinds of activity. Is right-wing activity simply just the kinds of events that happen racially, or are we talking about, as a few years ago, the man who crashed his light plane into an IRS building in Austin, Texas? So how do we count these things? How do they count? And that's the question that I have, first of all. And secondarily, who do we get to call a terrorist? Is it someone who is a Muslim or is of brown or black skin? Do we call white men terrorists that are doing the kinds of right-wing supremacist things? Do we call them terrorism, depending on how many people die? How do we count these things? And I think that is the important part, first off, and then second of all, do you count some people as terrorists more than you do others based on the fact of their ethnicity or their religious beliefs?